and we move on to the next speaker, who is Kaiser Huck. And he'll be introduced by Jatin. Jatin retired as Jatindra Kumar Naik is the full name. I call him Jatin because I've known him for a long time. Professor of English at Utkal University in Odisha in 2016. That's what he did. And he's also a wonderful translator, Jatin, and he's an award-winning translator and has co-edited Critical Discourse in Odia, which was published by Routledge in 2021, and he's going to chair the next talk.
Thank you, Amit. Needless to say, I have great pleasure in introducing Professor Kaiser Huck. He's a dear friend. I first got to know him through an insightful article he had published in London Magazine on Levi-Strauss' Three Topics way back in the 1980s. Then I met him in Delhi at a SARC literary conference. He guest edited a special issue of Mag Asia, focusing on Bangladesh, a journal I have been bringing out since 2013 on behalf of Center for Asian Studies. Professor Huck is one of our advisors. As we all know, Professor Huck is a distinguished poet, translator, and critic. He fought in the liberation war of Bangladesh and went on to...
I think you've been muted.
He has translated into English Tagore's Chaturanga, The Wonders of Vilayat, and his English translation titled The Triumph of the Snake Goddess was published by Harvard University Press. He has contributed a chapter to the People's Linguistic Survey of India, edited by G.N. Devi. The talk he will deliver today bears the playfully provocative title, The Perpetual Catwalk of Modernity. I so much look forward to him talking on this fascinating subject. Now I invite Professor Huck to make his presentation.
Thank you very much, Jatin, for a warm introduction. And thank you, Amit, for inviting me to this symposium. I come at the right moment because Professor Partha Mitter, I think, laid the foundation for today's series, and what he said about modernity in Bengal and Bengali literature is the background to my talk to a large extent. So I've added a little subtitle to my title, The Perpetual Catwalk of Modernity, the show scene from Bangladesh. While lazily channel browsing some years back, my attention was caught by an ongoing discussion on a now defunct Kolkata-based channel. In fact, that particular program is the only one I vividly remember from the short and distinguished life of Tara TV. Several participants had been marshaled to talk about Adhunikota, modernity. The session was in its final stages and seemed to have been an informal for and against debate. The only speaker I could watch had begun his spiel. I do not remember his name, but I was struck by his cheerful countenance and his engagingly animated and fluent delivery. He was of modest build, which might have been a consequence of a hyperactive metabolism. This is a retrospective observation I make in passing, because if I were to personify modernity, one of its conspicuous physical attributes would be hyperactive metabolism. The participant in question was an unabashed votary of modernity. I was immediately fascinated by his enthusiasm. He was a connoisseur of both the delights and discontents of modernity. As an example of the delights, he mentioned FTV, Could he have been inspired by Rollebart's mythologies, the essay on striptease? Perhaps. I wondered. Perhaps not. It didn't matter. And further back, of course, there were the figures of Mallarmé and Baudelaire. If I may paraphrase from what I doubtless can only recall imperfectly, FTV offers us continuous titillation, an endless catwalk of delectable figures, female and male, draped in diverse ways, from the splendidly elegant to the excitingly louche. Being male, the speaker breathlessly described the always partial revelations of the female body that mesmerize the male couch potato. The breasts almost but not quite popping out, the slit in the skirt that goes up almost but not quite all the way. Such are the pleasures proffered by modernity to the male gaze. Correspondingly, a woman commentator might easily wax lyrical about the pleasures offered by FTV to the female eye, I'm sure. The champion of modernity did not ignore its supposedly unsavory sides either. Yes, we are beset with anxiety, neuroses, melancholy, but these are to be embraced as unavoidable aspects of the human. He descanted on melancholy, Bishonnata in Bengali, and with visible jollity welcomed it into his life. I was reminded of Joyce's portrait of the artist as a young, where the rapidly maturing sensibility of Stephen Peters experiences the pangs of adolescence. At a children's party, Stephen sings a song and then, withdrawn into a snug corner of the room, he began to taste the joy of his loneliness. Teaching modern poetry to undergraduates, following a syllabus I helped design, I find myself trying to impress on them the darker aspects of the modern world. They are generally receptive and can write appropriately depressive answers in tests and make suitably pessimistic comments at the viva voce that concludes a course. At one of these, one of the girls whom one would describe as demure and personable and academically middling to fair, who in class always avoided getting into discussions, remarked in a refreshing gush of pent-up feeling that she didn't understand why the poems about modern city life painted a gloomy picture. Poems like Proof Rock and The Wasteland, Acquainted with the Night, Great Figure. Wasn't city life more enjoyable than living in the country? There were more places to hang out with friends, more fun things to do, etc., etc. I could not but agree that she definitely had a point and said she ought to have broached the matter in class so that we could have a jolly debate, weighing the pros and cons, and hopefully arrive at a satisfactory synthesis. I wished she had seen the Tara TV program. It would have struck a chord and perhaps given her the confidence to speak up in class. I'm sure she would enjoy watching FTV, which was on the menu of all servers until a few years back. I'm inclined to believe it was taken off the general range of channels in response to the complaints of prudish and puritanical elders. She would also have found a nuanced synthesis of the positive, pleasurable aspects of modern city life and its negative, disturbing ones in the personal lives and attitudes of the modern poets in her own city, Dhaka. But first, these poets need to be historically contextualized, socio-economically and politically. If I may use my own life as a temporal frame of reference, in 1950, Dhaka city, capital of the eastern province of the infant nation state of Pakistan, had 335,000 inhabitants, a newborn me being one of them. Unbeknownst to me, there was an embryonic milieu of modern poets and writers too. We grew up together, the post-colonial city, the modern writers milieu, and myself. By the time I reached my mid-teens, I had a slight acquaintance with modern poetry in English and Bengali, and in time would get to know many of the modern Bangla poets well. My exhibit A in the context of my students' critical comment would be Shahid Qadri, who I knew very well, was a friend, in fact, who died in 2016 in New York. Most readers would endorse the view of the poet critic Said Ali Hassan that among Bangladeshi poets, Shahid Qadri is the only one imbued with a truly urban sensibility. Born in Kolkata to a West Bengali mother and an East Bengali father who was a senior journalist on the Star of India, a Muslim League mouthpiece, Shahid had vivid memories of the wartime city, with GIs kicking their heels as they waited to be posted out. Come partition, Shahid's father took the advice of his spiritual preceptor, a peer, and decided to opt for India. He died suddenly, and with communal riots breaking out, the family, comprising besides Shahid, his elder brother, younger sister, and mother, moved to Dhaka. From a city of over 4.5 million to a provincial town that would take more than a decade and a half to reach a population of 1 million. Shahid, still a schoolboy, was quick to adapt, urban sensibility and all, and make himself at home. Even after he left Dhaka in the late 70s, never to return, it remained his spiritual home, object of a poignant, unrealizable longing to return. He was never prolific as a poet, though he was precocious, publishing a poem in Buddhadev Bose's Kobita in his mid-teens. He told me with evident relish about his youthful flânery, reciting Eliot and Dylan Thomas and Buddhadev Bose's Baudelaire translations as he looked upon the city, crowds, or the Buriganga River flowing past with sailboats or chugging motor launches, and occasionally hitting a local bar to order, as one might in a Hollywood film noir, Scotch and soda, make it double. And yet, in his poetry, the mood is elegiac, melancholy, marked by alienation from the consumerist. The young Shahid Qadri exemplified the modern Bohemian poet and left a lasting impress on a generation of writers and poets in Bangladesh. The memoirs of two of his contemporaries are worth highlighting. The first is Belal Chaudhry, 1938 to 2018, himself a poet and man of letters of note, who interestingly lived illegally in Kolkata from 1963 to 73 or thereabouts. A close friend of the two leading Kolkata poets of his generation, Sunil Gangopadhyay and Shakti Chattopadhyay. He was a much loved figure on the Kolkata literary scene and edited 4 issues of the avant-garde journal of their coterie, Krittibash. To Belal Chaudhry, Shakti and Shahid were the arch-Bohemian poets of the two Bengals. Belal Chaudhry was a fellow Bohemian companion of Qadri's in the Dhaka of the late 50s and early 60s, and for some time in Chittagong, the country's second city, with a history going back to the times of Sinbad the Sailor, where uncharacteristically, Qadri allowed himself to be put into a suit for a brief spell as a medical representative. In Dhaka, Shahid's day would begin at midday, and he would spend the time until the dawn of the following day, moving unhurriedly from cafe to cafe, most famously at a still extant one called beauty boarding, which was what Kolkata's coffee house was to its literati, or Café de Flore existed in Paris. In fact, Shahid was instrumental in turning beauty boarding into an adda hub for Dhaka's literary milieu. His perambulations would end at the railway station, where he would hang around till the tea stalls started frying jalebis and preparing the first round of morning tea. These would be his chota hazri before he headed home. In considering Qadri's bohemianism vis-a-vis Shakti Chattopadhyay's in Kolkata, or that of the Beat generation and elsewhere, including Kolkata, Ginsberg sojourn, long spell, it is worth remembering that Qadri's Dhaka was a small town of 500,000 people and not the mega city it is today, with a population of more than 20 million, exceeding that of Kolkata. If Kolkata-centered modernity provincialized Europe, Dhaka carried the provincialization a degree further. If it wasn't a provincial capital, I would have introduced the term mufassilizing Europe, but I'll save that for an extension of adaptation, mufassil level. For now, I would like to claim that mufassil modern is a term with considerable critical potential. Indeed, I would go so far as to claim that the greatest modern poet in Bengali is a Mufassal modernist. Indeed, it is, of course, Jibanananda Das, whose genius was firmly rooted in Mufassal Barishal and its surrounding countryside. But whether modernism, bohemian or otherwise, manifests itself in a metropolis, a provincial city, or a Mufassal town, it deserves to be considered on the same level. There is no hierarchy here. A trend or movement may originate somewhere and travel, but each of its manifestations is distinctive, if it is not crude and shameless imitation, of course. And all its forms, so to speak, exist on the same ontological plane. No matter where an interesting modern work is published, it is always from a strange and sublime address. Qadri's coeval, Abdullah Abu Said, also Kolkata born, in his memoir Bhalobashar Sampan, Sampan filled with love, gives a vivid picture of Qadri's bohemianism as well as his literary influence. Quote, many of the young writers of the first half of the 60s imbibed their modernism from him, Said declares. And further, what everyone, from senior writers to young aspirants, looked upon with fascination, that deracinated psyche of Western modernity, the unworldly bohemianism of Baudelaire or the American beats, the outsider of Camus' fiction, Eliot's Hollow Man, all these Qadri absorbed and made his own, and thereby became an enigma to us. But he belonged to no group or coterie. He stood alone. He was the supreme leader of his one-man band. Utterly devoid of any sense of home, Shahid was the first bohemian personality in the new Dhaka that was then taking shape. Not that organized coteries and manifesto-driven movements were unknown in Dhaka. While the Beat generation hit Time magazine and the Hungry generation stirred up Kolkata, Dhaka came up with the Sad generation. And following on its heels, No. The Sad generation announced itself in 1964 with a bilingual 16-page bulletin of the same title. It opened with a manifesto in rather shaky English by the poet Rafiq Azad, and ended with a sort of prose poem by Prashanto Ghoshal, also in bad English, addressed to Rafiq Azad, entitled Champabuti, a catharsis of pent-up passions. The poems in the middle, in Bengali, were by half a dozen poets, of whom 2 are still active. Although the movement was short-lived, very short-lived, few even in Bangladesh know about it. So a few excerpts from the manifesto may have some curiosity value. We don't know what we are doing. We have no friends. We hate conventional life. We cannot tolerate the conventional notions of private and public morality. Life is meaningless. We are living meaninglessly. We are constantly living in anxieties. We know the intensity of our anxieties to feel and know that we exist, and that is the root of all our anxieties. I should warn the headless conventional gentlemen and the bloody critics in this connection that we are not sex-driven youths. We are faithful to ourselves and to our sadness. There should be no doubt in it. We are not beatniks or angry. Remember, we are biponno, and that is why we are sad. We are for no time interested in politics and newspapers. Then what do we want? Nothing, nothing. We want nothing from our bloody society. We are exhausted, annoyed, tired, and sad. And here's the last part of Prashanto Ghoshal's prose poem. Champavati, a lady excommunicated by the cruel stroke of society, for no fault of hers, is a boon companion. In her, I recognize a perfect juxtaposition of peace and destruction. Rafiq, a sincere friend of mine, remains always depressed in this age of reason, what with insecurity and what with hellfire of the earth. And I, a middleman between the two with my deceitful existence, am in a mysterious process of decay. Women, except Champavati, foxy and sexy, do not know the meaning of life. Rafiq, Don't pay attention to a lady. There's a youthful nihilism here in a brash, naive form, and an underlying misogyny. These can be explained with reference to the small-town puritanical social context. But why the two pieces in English when Bengali was the obvious literary language of the writers, a language they habitually wrote in? Perhaps the use of English, a language cultivated by the educated classes, heightened the intended shock effect. But it is noteworthy that Kaiser inserts into his English manifesto the Bengali word vipanno, imperiled, the key word describing the mental state of his suicide, one of Jivanananda Das's best-known poems. Abdullah Abu Said, who was one of the poets in the bulletin, notes in his memoir, innocuous in appearance, the Sad Generation bulletin proved to be a bombshell that shook the town. The quiet town of Dhaka, hurt and flabbergasted, reacted by hurling abuses. Apart from its nihilism, the Sad Generation bulletin created tremors for another reason as well. Its pages were reeking with the raw smell of sexuality. In this respect, the young poets were as reckless as they were immature. Rafiq Azad was also loosely associated with Na, whose more active advocates were a group of engineering and architecture students and an artist fresh from a spell of training in Paris. The novelist Mahmoudul Haq declared solidarity. Somewhat Dadaist in orientation, the group published 4 issues of their journal, which was of course titled Na, No. Each issue had a different unconventional format. The second issue, of which I once had a copy, was printed on brown wrapping paper, measured 5.5 inches across and at least half a yard long, with covers cut out of jute sacking. One issue was circular, another had a number of sides. The most Dadaist of the group, Qazi Shahid Hassan, provocatively declares in a note, "It is my personal belief that in order to rescue poetry from its present state, we need to compose poems with the skeletal remains of letters, news, detective stories, novels, advertisements, adversarial thought, the imagination, etc. Such poems may draw the reader. A longer manifesto promised for the 4th and final issue didn't materialize. Both the Sad Generation and Na have become forgotten chapters of literary history." However, the brash and naivety of these movements ought to be seen in a positive light. In the socio-cultural context in which they emerged, they were a rebellious force that shook up the state government-patronized literary establishment, which was encouraged to drum up publicity for the official religion-based nationalism. The ideology had already been challenged by the Bhasha Andolon of 1952, the student-led movement to have Bengali recognized as one of the state languages. The aftermath of the movement saw a cultural resurgence in which the modern poets and writers were key contributors. In 1953, one of the noteworthy modern poets, Hassan Hafizur Rahman, put together an anthology titled Ekushe February, among whose contributors Shamsur Rahman, the greatest of the modern poets in Bangladesh. Songs were written and sung, pictures painted, plays written and produced. The language movement acted as a catalyst that turned the modern poets into political activists. Not that there was a happy marriage of modern writers and political ideologues. Some in the leftist camp looked askance at what they considered to be decadent aspects of modern literature. Abdullah Abu Said ruefully recounts in his memoir that when he launched a journal of modern writing, Contrashore, he hoped for the approbation of an upcoming young academic. To his dismay, the scholar and orthodox Marxist poured scorn on the venture. And yet, as the pro-democracy movement gathered force and the progressive cultural forum dubbed Lekhok Shibir, Writers' Camp, was launched, among those who joined it were writers who combined political commitment with modern modes of writing. Among them were 2 of the best-known modern fiction writers, of the country, Hasan Azizul and Akhtaruzzman Ilyas, whose novel Khwab, The Book of Dreams, has been described by Supriya Chaudhary as perhaps the greatest Bengali novel. Shamsur Rahman, who is an urban modernist rooted in old Dhaka, shared Qadri's penchant for flânerie, though not to the same extent. He mentions spending the whole night walking about with Qadri on hearing of the death of Jibananand Das. As the democratic movement, which would culminate in the War of Independence, gained momentum, Shamsur Rahman captured the strange alteration brought to the cityscape by a general strike, a hartal, as the title has it. The viewpoint is that of a flaneur who notes that the city is like a child asleep at its mother's breast, or perhaps like Rodin's thinker. He compares the quiet of the city to that of Prophet Muhammad as he made for the cave where he used to meditate. Fancifully, the speaker replaces the advertisements on hoardings with his favorite poems. To put these random notes on modern writing in Bangladesh in perspective, a general consideration of modernity is called for. That takes us to the problems outlined in Amit's concept note. First, the Indian sociologists' discomfited dismissal of modernity as a conference topic. I would have loved to hear the sociologist speak at this webinar. I'll not, however, speculate on what he might have said. Instead, let us note some of the problems that arise when we use the term modern. The modern has to be seen in contrast to the not modern. If the modern is represented by A and the not modern by not A, we will find that lists of disparate items and phenomena can be placed under the terms in binary opposition. If we put all the poets mentioned above under A, we may oppose them with Puritan and anti-democratic ideologues, writers engaged in promoting the official ideology of the day, and also orthodox Marxists. Common binary oppositions are set up between modernists and romantics, or Victorians or realists. And yet, if we broaden the perspective and place the historical category of modernism, a movement that is said by some to have flourished between 1890 and 1939, we will have to consider it as a subset of modernity, the concept that the Indian sociologist found uncongenial. A few rough and ready comments on modernity should therefore be apropos. Modernity encompasses numerous varied, if not exactly opposed, trends and movements. The overarching opposition, according to many critics, is that between modernity and the medieval. When the Middle Ages slowly ended, modernity steadily emerged. The Renaissance was its first cultural configuration. But this is not a watertight distinction, as Umberto Eco engagingly argues in the essay, The Return of the Middle Ages. The reason for revivals of aspects of medieval culture in the modern and postmodern age is an underlying connection. According to Eco, looking at the Middle Ages means looking at our infancy. In the same way that a doctor, to understand our present state of health, asks us about our childhood, or in the same way that the psychoanalyst, to understand our present neuroses, makes a careful investigation of the primal scene. Quote, our return to the Middle Ages is a quest for our roots, and since we want to come back to the real roots, we are looking for reliable Middle Ages, not for romance and fantasy. Unquote. Nor is this a phenomenon of our times only. Quote, immediately after the official ending of the Middle Ages, Europe was ravaged by a pervasive medieval nostalgia. Unquote. So the Middle Ages get on the catwalk of modernity. What about further back? The ancients never lost their appeal, but we look upon them now in a different way. Take the last works of Michel Foucault and their break with the earlier studies of the conventionally recognized modern era. As Frederick Gross, in his foreword to the recently published Confessions of the Flesh, the final volume of the history of sexuality notes, the plan to study the modern biopolitical dispositif of sexuality, 16th through 19th century, was dropped in favor of the problematization through a rereading of the philosophers, physicians, and orators of Greco-Roman antiquity, of sexual pleasure from the historical perspective of a genealogy of the desiring subject, and under the conceptual horizon of the arts of existence. With the phrases the desiring subject and the arts of existence, we are firmly in our times, and now must accept that we have a vital connection with antiquity. So the ancients too get on the catwalk of modernity. And even further back, the primitive too has long been inseparable from modernity. Primitivism is a vital aspect of modern art and literature. There are some piquant oppositions within modernity as well. In the penultimate episode of The Big Bang Theory, when Sheldon Cooper is complimented for his Renaissance mind, if I remember rightly, he snorts, "Huh, the Renaissance. I am an Enlightenment person," or words to that effect. Despite the critiques of some postmodernists, Enlightenment now is an indispensable aspect of the scientific worldview. Steven Pinker equates Enlightenment with modernity, and the Romantic and the postmodern as its enemies. But Romanticism and postmodernism too are simply further twists in the evolution of modernity. One can get into a leotard and hop onto the catwalk of modernity. What distinguishes modernity then? Perhaps simply that its opposite is the view of reality sub specie eternitatis, under the aspect of eternity. Whereas in the world of onitto, impermanence, we exist under the aspect of modernity. Like it or not, we need the concept of modernity to make sense of human reality. It may have come soiled by colonialism, but post-colonialism cannot be articulated without recourse to modernity, to the concept of modernity. It seems to me now that historical time as we know it is the catwalk of modernity. Of the four yugas, Satya, Treta, Dwapara, seem to be prehistoric. The Kali Yuga brings us into history and is our catwalk. Those of us who try to write must get on the catwalk of modernity and perform their Monty Python silly walks, while others play the critic or simply watch. Like many, I enjoy all three catwalk-related activities. Thank you. That's my sort of the written part, which I've read out. I may add that well, in Bangladesh, the sort of state of modern poetry and modern literature has changed quite a bit. At the age of the modern, I think, is gone. I mean, poets nowadays do not call themselves modern poets, whereas the generation of Shamsur Rahman and Shahid Taji, they did. They were modern poets, self-consciously modern poets. And the label was widely accepted. Now, I mean, some call themselves postmodern, which is absurd in the case of poetry. I can think of only one school of poets who can legitimately be called postmodernists, and they're the language poets of America. And magic realism is quite popular. So all these new terms which come and go, I think, have taken over from the modern. And again, I mean, as Amit also pointed out, that modernism or even the modern and modernity are not the same, although they are intimately related. And so I would see modernity as the sort of kind of underlying or overarching phenomenon. and all the different movements that we have seen in art history and literary history as aspects of modernity. And this will continue as far as I can see. Thank you.
Okay. As expected, that was a fascinating presentation, Professor Hawke. You have brought a lost world vividly alive. Modernism is no mere abstraction in your presentation. One can almost see, smell, and touch it, feel its rich, vibrant sensuousness. So you have made a fantastic presentation. And now your presentation is open to questions. I invite questions, comments, and observations. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Any questions?
Somebody's raised their hand.
Okay, so should I read out the, okay, let me see.
I think he can put the question to Kaiser himself. I don't think he's written out the question in chat.
I see no questions in the chat.
Yeah, so Pradeep, why don't you unmute yourself and ask the question?
Who?
Sure, Professor. Thank you, Kaiser sir, for the talk. My question was like, how do I distinguish? So I'm not a poet, and I'm not very familiar with poetries, but I've read Jivananand Das and Shahidullah Kaiser, and I'm from Bangladesh as well. So how do I distinguish between? How do I say, okay, can I say, okay, Jivananand Das poetry is not modern poetry, but Shahidullah Kaiser's poetry is modern poetry, and how do I distinguish between the two?
Shahidullah Kaiser is the fiction writer, and Jivananand Das is definitely modern. Shahidullah Kaiser was actually a card-carrying member of the Communist Party. He was a socially committed, politically committed writer. So his aesthetics is sort of social realism, whereas in the case of Jivananand Das, it's a sort of post-romantic form of modernism, which has been very popular in Bengal. Does that answer your question?
I think so. I have a very naive question. If you give me permission, I can ask. I'm still not sure. Like, how do I distinguish when I see a poetry, a form of poetry? How do I say is it modern poetry or not?
Well, I mean, take the language. I mean, when Pound said "make it new," and when the imagists insisted on using concrete language. The language of modern poetry will strike you as the living language of the time.
Got it.
The imagery will be clear and sharp. There'll be irony, use of symbolism in different ways. So it's and definitely it will not have the air of romantic poetry, whether Keatsian or Wordsworthian or Victorian, as in Tennyson. See? So there will be no sort of romanticization of, let's say, mythic medieval period, as in Tennyson. So I think one can list these different aspects of writing. So there are modes of modern writing which you can actually sort of create a taxonomy of all these different modes. But I would say yes. I mean, modern poetry is, and then it's also experimental. It tends not to use conventional forms. There's a predominance of free verse and free forms. In French, prose poetry is very important. Nearly half of modern French poetry is prose poetry, in fact.
I think we only have time because we're running quite late because we started 10 minutes late because of Zoom related problems. For one more question, I think Toral Gajarwala raised a hand.
Yes.
Okay.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you for the presentation. And if we don't have time, you can also respond maybe elsewhere or through the chat. Really, I found this presentation totally fascinating and picking up on so many, I think, kind of affective tenors of the moment that, you know, a kind of new sensibility that's being inaugurated in the period. So that's one thing. I guess I wanted to ask, like, to what you attribute the sense of sadness in this manifesto. So I was struck by two things. One, this sort of refusal of the political, that, you know, we are not interested in politics anymore. And two, we are faithful to our sadness. In other words, there's a kind of truism to our emotional intensity that we are holding on to. So I was just wondering if you could speculate on what kind of political context is generating this new direction in the manifesto. And the second thing is about mufassilizing. I thought that was really interesting. So maybe I was thinking about small as a category. So as opposed to the big city, a smaller town or smaller city, and how it might link to sad. In other words, is sad and bad also related to small, to a sense of smallness, you know, in the world?
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah. The first question has to do with the historical context. That manifesto was published in 1964 when General Ayub Khan was ruling Pakistan. There was no democracy. And so that turning away from politics means saying that in the present situation, no viable political activity is possible. There was a martial law. But later on, as the democracy movement gathered steam, the same poets became activists. You know? And in fact, Rafiq Azad took part in the Liberation War himself. So you see, this change took place very dramatically over the 60s. The second question was, what was it about? Just nudge my memory.
The second question was about smallness.
So yeah, right. Sadness and smallness. Well, you know, one point I should have added is that that age of flânery and bohemianism is gone. See, Dhaka today has, I think, 21 million people, and it's overcrowded. You don't feel sad; you feel depressed. Now, the sadness that the poets wrote about, it's a bit like the loneliness that the young Stephen Dedalus, you know, relished. You know, so this sadness again, the use of the word sad is, I find, historically interesting. You know, nowadays we don't say I'm feeling sad. I say I'm feeling a bit down or depressed. Depressed is the usual word people use. You know? Whereas I think in the 50s, you had Lévi-Strauss writing Tristropik, yeah, the ballad of the sad cafe. You see the word sad, bonjour tristesse, you know, the word sad in more than one language, you know, it sort of seemed to be very popular and seemed to capture a particular mood, you know. So I think that phase is gone in our cultural history. I think the cities also look different now. You know, the Café de Flore is a tourist trap. The coffee house in Calcutta, as the famous song has it, you know, is no longer what it was.
Great.
Okay, I think we should bring this session to an end and move on to the next.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Hall.
Thank you, Jatin, for chairing the talk. And Kaiser, that was wonderfully absorbing. I look forward to reading it and, you know, putting it out there on the Literary Activism website, if I may. It was fantastic.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.